This is the Citizen of Heaven podcast, the Money Edition. I am Hal Hammons, and I am a citizen of heaven, and I am your embedded correspondent in Satan's world. I bring you this message of hope from Pensacola, Florida. This is report number 32, dated November 12th, in the year of our Lord 2019. I bid God's grace and peace to all my fellow sojourners here in this earthly plane. I remain sound in body, alert in mind, and energized in spirit. In this special episode, we will take a special look at the Christian's relationship with money. We will discuss the myth of priorities. Thinking we can balance commitments to money and the Lord is wrongheaded and doomed to tip to the wrong side. We will discuss Barbarians at the Gate, a book that details the buyout of RJR Nabisco. When making money is the only objective, there's no limit to how insane the behavior can get. We'll be discussing professional athletes and their contracts. Measuring men by their wallets is par for the course in sports. That's not the kind of role model we need these days. We will discuss London, a board game in which you are forced to balance a growing economy with the real problems that it creates. Turns out more prosperity is not necessarily better. Are you ready? Here we go. This is what I've been preaching. I'd like to begin by giving a shout out to my good friend Chris Emerson and his excellent podcast, Excel Still More. If you haven't already started listening to that, you need to. It is wonderful, and one of his episodes gave me the impetus to preach the sermon that provided the impetus for this particular segment. It was called The Priorities Myth, and he made the case, and I'm not sure exactly it was original to Chris, but he was arguing that there is no such thing as priorities. There is only priority in the singular. By the very nature of things, a priority is something that comes first. You can't have more than one of those things. There is only one. And I'm not sure I'd ever really thought about it that way, but that makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to try to avoid using the word priorities in that kind of context in the future, because lots of times when Christians talk about getting their priorities straight, they mean, yes, understand your relationship with God, and supposedly that's coming first, but there are other things that are important too. And I fear that priorities, plural, has been used as an excuse to prop up our efforts to balance spiritual priorities, as it were, and carnal priorities. And it's in direct violation of what Jesus said from the very beginning. You've heard the sermon any number of times, I'm sure. Luke 16, verse 13. You cannot serve God and mammon. You cannot serve God and money. You only have one master. And if you have trouble figuring out which one it is, it's not really all that difficult. Just ask yourself a couple of questions. What is your habit? Do you habitually wake up in time to get to work? And habitually sleep late and miss Bible class or come in late on Sunday morning? What gets sacrificed? Are you more likely to sacrifice your 401k contribution, or are you more likely to sacrifice your church contribution? What is it that gets discussed all the time? What are you obsessing over in your conversation with people? Your job, the work that you do, how much money you're making at it, or your relationship with Jesus? It's really not nearly as complicated as we make it out to be. Maybe you should ask your kids. Your kids might be able to tell you with a little more honesty than you're used to what is actually important in your family. If we can look at ourselves honestly and make an honest assessment, you know what? Money is too important in my life. Jesus needs to be the priority. Seek first his kingdom. I understand that. I know that. I accept that. At least intellectually, I accept that. But my life does not seem to reflect that. What can I do to help? What can I do to grow in the direction that I say I want to grow in? Well, I'm going to offer you two approaches to this, and they build on one another. And the first one is that you need to work from the outside in. And what I mean by that is simply do the right thing. That may sound overly simplistic, but stick with me on this. Do the right thing. If the right thing is to read your Bible every day, then you do it. And if you find obstacles, if you find barriers, if you find distractions or discouragement, you do it anyway. You work from the outside in. You do what God has told you to do every single time. John writes for us in John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21 about coming from the darkness into the light and how awkward it is and how painful, in fact, it is. And most people in the darkness can't make it. We need to accept that if we are trying to build positive habits, if we're going to build spiritual priority in our life, it's not going to be easy. It's going to hurt, in fact. In the short term, it may hurt a lot. But that doesn't mean it's a bad idea. That just means we are entrenched in bad ideas already. And we need to get out of those ideas and into good ideas. As awkward and as painful and as uncomfortable as it may be, we need to do that. If we find that our heart is not in our service, if we're just kind of going through the motions, we're doing it because we have to. I'm reading my Bible every day because the preacher's going to give me a hard time if I don't. I feel guilty about not doing it. My heart's not in it. You do it anyway. If you've ever been the parent of a 12-year-old, you know what we're talking about here. If you have a 12-year-old child whose heart is not in going to school, you send the child to school anyway. And if their heart never gets into it, you send the child anyway, over and over and over again. Maybe the good habits become ingrained in them. Maybe they learn to appreciate the better things, and maybe they don't. But either way, they're going to do the right thing. That's what we need to do for ourselves. Do the right thing. And if we find that our motivation is not what it ought to be, stick with it. Maybe that motivation will grow. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 6 and verses 19, 20, and 21, that we put our treasure in spiritual things. We invest in heaven, he says. Lay up our treasure in heaven, because where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. Now, he doesn't say where our heart is, our treasure will be also. He says it the other way around. And I think what he means by that is that if you invest a hearty amount of treasure over and over again in spiritual areas, you're going to find one day that you value what you're investing in. It becomes important. All your treasure is there. Why wouldn't you put your heart there? So get in the habit of putting your treasure, putting your emphasis, putting your behavior in the right place, and see if the attitude doesn't follow along. And the second way that you do it is the opposite. Build from the inside out. And you start with the first one. You start with the outside and build the habits on the inside. But as you establish a spiritual foothold in your behavior, start building from the inside out. Build these good, positive habits. Build positive attitudes over time. It takes a while to prioritize spiritual things, but you're going to find that the more invested you get in the Spirit, the more invested you get in Jesus Christ, the easier this process becomes. Now, all the gardening experts tell you the best way to keep weeds out of your lawn is to have a healthy crop of grass. The grass will keep out the weeds if the grass is healthy enough. And that's what good things will do to our life with regard to temptation. If you are busy, if you are fully invested in doing spiritual things, you're going to find that there's not enough room in your heart to give place to sin. The temptations get weaker. The opportunities get fewer. You get stronger and stronger in your faith. You sow to the Spirit, as Paul says in Galatians chapter 6, verses 8 and 9. If you sow to the Spirit, you're going to reap. If you sow to the flesh, you're going to reap there too. But we want to reap in the Spirit. So you sow to the Spirit, and you don't grow weary in well-doing. You continue to do the right thing, as we were saying before. And the more you do it, the more you're going to find this positive upswelling of spiritual values, of spiritual priority in your life that will crowd out all those bad influences that we say we're trying to get rid of. James says in James chapter 1, verse number 21, that this process, the putting the word into work in our lives, will help us get rid of what the Old King James Version has, superfluity, however it's pronounced, the excess of wickedness. And he's not saying there that there may be a little bit of excess that we get rid of and we can keep the cup full of evil. He's saying that every bit of these bad impulses, every bit of this bad behavior that used to dominate us can and will be expunged if we properly give Jesus a place in our heart. If you build from the outside in and then start building from the inside out, before too long, you're going to realize that Jesus is, in fact, your only priority. The money may suffer, but we're going to find that we care less and less about that because we care about Jesus more. We've been sown to the Spirit. We're reaping in the Spirit now. Anyway, that's what I've been preaching. This is what I've been reading. Barbarians at the Gate by Brian Burrow and John Hilliard is a story of RJR Nabisco, a financial entity that existed for about 2.5 years in the mid-1980s. Those who are millennial and younger may be surprised to hear that Winston cigarettes and Oreo cookies used to be made by the same company. A company named it RJR Nabisco. RJ Reynolds, the cigarette people, and Nabisco, the cracker and cookie people. They merged under the leadership of a man named F. Ross Johnson in the mid-1980s. And Ross Johnson was quite a character. He loved being president of RJR Nabisco, largely because of the perks. Now, the six-figure salary didn't hurt anything, obviously, but mostly he liked the perks. He liked what he called Team Nabisco, all the former athletes that he would get on RJR Nabisco planes, and there were a dozen of them, I think. People like Jack Nicklaus and Frank Gifford and people of that sort that would fly out to these golf tournaments and collect hundreds of thousands of dollars for 5 or 6 days of work a year. Ross loved the jet-setting lifestyle. One particular story has to be told, what is known far and wide as the dog story. On a trip to Palm Springs for the golf tournament that RJR Nabisco was sponsoring out there, he was there with his wife and entourage, of course, on the RJR Nabisco plane, and his dog bit somebody. And there was a police report filed, and the police wanted to impound the dog. Nobody was in serious trouble, but they needed to send the dog through tests and that sort of thing, make sure that everything was on the up and up. And that did not fit in with Ross's schedule. So he flew the dog back to New York City on the RJR Nabisco jet. He jetted a dog across the country. Ross Johnson does not deny this story. He does insist that it wasn't just the dog that was on the flight. There were humans that were flying also, which very well may be true. It makes for a pretty interesting story either way, though. This is the level of indulgence that we're talking about here. A man who saw his job as promoting the brand. And a major measurement of the brand was stock price. And because of the negative impression that people had of tobacco, and still do, the stock price just kind of lingered in the low 40s on Wall Street. And Ross decided the thing to do would be to buy out the company in a maneuver known as a leveraged buyout. And I'm not qualified to discuss LBOs in this forum here. If I were qualified, I wouldn't have time. But basically what it boils down to is buying up all of the stock and turning it from a publicly traded company into a private company. He offered $75 a share for a company that was trading in the low 40s. And word got out that the company was up for purchase, and everything went crazy. It did not sell for $75 a share. It sold for $109 a share. $25 billion, the biggest financial transaction in the history of planet Earth at that time. Ironically, it did not go to Ross Johnson. It went to a man named Henry Kravis, who was the head of KKR, Kohlberg Kravis Robertson Company, a New York City financial firm. They got in competition, and they wound up winning the competition, mostly because word leaked out of what Ross was going to get paid for this deal. And that's where it gets really weird, if it wasn't weird already. The New York Times reported that the financial package that Ross Johnson was going to receive as a result of this buyout was in the neighborhood of $2 billion, billion with a B, that Ross and his people were going to get. Now, he denied that that was all for him and said that a lot of it was for his team, et cetera, and they would never reach those levels because of conditions that were placed on it, et cetera. But there was no getting around the idea that this was just an enormous and almost unprecedented demonstration of greed on the part of a person. And ultimately, the board of directors, who thought Ross was great before all of this went on, decided they would do whatever they had to do to not sell the company to Ross Johnson. It's just an amazing story, really, at every level. The idea that Henry Kravis, a man who has everything in the world, who is the undisputed ruler in the realm of LBOs, would feel like he had to spend $25 billion to buy a company simply because it was the largest one ever done, and he couldn't afford to let somebody else do it. His ego would just absolutely require that he be the one in charge of this deal. This is the extremes where ego will get involved when money becomes a god. And that's essentially what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, verse 5, where covetousness or greed amounts to idolatry, he says there. That is the most obvious, maybe not the biggest, but the most obvious demonstration of how our physical lives can become the end-all be-all. We are essentially worshiping money. This is how we measure our success. This is how we measure our standing, because of what we were able to do in financial circles. It reminds us a great deal of the rich farmer in Luke chapter 12. Jesus tells a story starting verse number 16, a parable saying the land of a rich man was very productive, and he began reasoning to himself, saying, "What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, "This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And who will own now what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." What's worse? Working hard so that you never have to work again, so that you have absolutely no reliance on yourself, on anybody but yourself, or working hard for the sake of working hard, acquiring money so that you can go acquire more money. When is anything other than self-glorified in all of this? Surely that's the takeaway from all of this. Promoting ourselves at the expense of others, at the expense of common decency, and certainly at the expense of our relationship with God, is not something that God is going to tolerate. He requires that we channel our ego, that we channel our compulsions and serve him instead of serving ourselves. We could argue exactly how much this greed cost Ross Johnson. In the end, he was bought out of the company for $60 million. He got $60 million to go away and never be seen again. So you could argue that he landed on his feet okay. But he certainly did not get what he was hoping to get. And there's very little doubt that if he had asked for a little bit less, he would have gotten far more than he ever possibly could have spent. What we need to do as God's people is trust that God is the provider, that God takes care of us, and that whatever he sees fit to give to us in the short term is not only sufficient for our physical needs, but also a demonstration of his overall attitude of love and support and caring for us, especially in spiritual areas. Surely if God can provide for us in carnal areas, he will do so in spiritual areas as well. We seek first his kingdom, and all these things are going to be added to us. That's what Jesus promises us in Matthew 6, verse 33, a passage that we refer to over and over again on this podcast, and will continue to do so, because that's the emphasis that we need to have in our lives, trusting that God will provide, not necessarily at the level that we want to be provided for, but then again, maybe it's not in our best interest in the long term to just get. Maybe God has better things in mind for us than that. Anyway, that's what I've been reading. This is what I've been hearing. The day after this episode drops, Major League Baseball will announce the winners of the annual Cy Young Awards. It is widely speculated that Gerrit Cole of my own Houston Astros will be the winner in the American League. If he is not the winner, he will certainly be in second place next to his teammate Justin Verlander. It just so happens, and every Astros fan knows this, that Gerrit Cole's contract is up. He is now a free agent. And it is widely speculated that he is never going to play a game in the Houston Astros uniform again. That the Astros are not going to be able to meet his asking price, which very well may be true. And Astros fans are pretty upset about that because they really enjoyed their time with Gerrit Cole playing for the Houston Astros. He had a tremendous season this year. If he does win the Cy Young, he deserves it. And this is usually time for a native Texan to chime in about state income taxes and standard of living and how actually living in Texas is better than living in California or living in New York or whatever for all kinds of economic and non-economic reasons. And I'm not going to do that here because in a very real sense, for professional athletes, those things are irrelevant. It's not about whether you're going to be able to profit more financially from one deal versus another deal. That's not the only consideration. One of the big considerations, maybe the biggest consideration with regard to professional athletes, when you're talking about these astronomical sums of money, amounts of money that you would think anyway they would never be able to spend. It's not so much a matter of standard of living as it is the number on the check. Relative worth, relative value in professional sports is measured in dollars. First and foremost, in dollars. If you get a bigger paycheck, that means you're a better baseball player or football player or what have you. That is the easiest way, and sometimes the only way, to measure relative worth. And so therefore there is a compulsion among professional athletes to get the biggest contract they can get. Not just so they'll have a lot of money for themselves and their families and whatever charities they want to give to or whatever, but so that they'll be number 1 or number 5 or number 10 or whatever it happens to be. Being at the top, having as much on your check as you possibly can, is in and of itself a goal. And whether that is a healthy thing for athletes, whether it's healthy for Major League Baseball, is a whole other discussion. It's almost certainly not healthy for baseball fans, but that's another consideration. My point here is that it is not healthy for us in general as human beings, whether you're professional athletes or professional plumbers or whatever, to value your worth as a human being in any sense in financial terms. Not just because it degrades us as human beings or whatever kind of esoteric argument you might want to make, but because of who we are as creatures of God, because of our inherent spiritual nature. It is necessary for us, if we are to understand our nature, if we understand our purpose in the world, to value ourselves in spiritual terms. And simply evaluating ourselves based on how much money or how much square footage or how much horsepower or whatever other kind of carnal measurement you might want to use, measuring simply on those terms, misses the whole point of our experience here as human beings. The passage that I've based this podcast around, Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, deals with the aftermath of this concept in a conversation about carnality, in a conversation about carnality among Christians, in fact. Backing up a little bit to verse number 17, Paul writes, "Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern that you have in us." That is the good pattern. "For many walk, of whom I often told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ." Christians, mind you here. Now, we're talking about people out in the world. We're talking about Christians whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is their shame, who set their minds on earthly things. And that's the main point that we're going to get at here. The idea of their God being their appetite. That's an amazing image there. Their belly, I think, is the more literal translation here. The idea of serving and even worshiping your stomach is just a fascinating metaphor as far as I'm concerned. Your belly, your stomach, of course, is the most obvious way that you would take care of your physical body. That's what he's trying to say here. You're worshiping yourself when you have this kind of attitude, when you ignore spiritual things, when you prioritize carnal things. And this is what being a citizen of heaven is all about. As he goes on to say, our citizenship is in heaven, he says. This is where our priority is. This is where we consider ourselves to be at home, not in the body, but with the Lord in heaven. And if you lose sight of that, if you get caught up in the carnality of this world, and there's a lot of it, of course, we have impulses all over the place by people who do not care anything about God or the things of God. And such ones have always existed, going all the way back to Cain. When we drink too deeply from that fountain, when we indulge too much in the vices of the flesh, we lose sight of who we are. We start measuring ourselves by what we do and how much we have and that sort of thing. We're told in Ecclesiastes 6, verse 7, all man's labor is for his mouth, yet the appetite is not satisfied. As long as you continue to pursue satisfaction and meaning and purpose in the things of this life, you will never be satisfied, no matter how much of it you may get. Alex Rodriguez signed a contract back in 2000 for $252 million over 10 years. Well, that just sets the stage for some other contract somewhere. Mike Trout signed a contract last year for $430 million over 12 years. How big can these contracts get? I don't know. There is no upper limit to any of this because there's no upper limit to human greed. We, as the people of God, know better than that. We have to resist this urge to measure ourselves in carnal terms and measure ourselves by the content of our spirit. Anyway, that's what I've been hearing. If you want to stop listening at this point and go your way, I hope you found the message instructive, inspiring, and most of all, faithful to God's Word. Please don't forget to like, rate, share, subscribe, and follow. But if you stick around for a few more minutes, I would like to share with you a way to amuse yourself in a wholesome manner while waiting here in Satan's world, and perhaps pick up a spiritual point or two in the process. This is what I've been playing. I discovered something interesting about the Hammons family board game collection while I was trying to choose a game to fit this segment in the podcast this week. Apparently, the Hammons family just doesn't like games about money. We have lots of games that have money, of course, that feature money in one form or another. Lots of games that are where you even keep score by how much money you raise by trading in Far East trade routes or building a farm in Ireland or what have you. But I can't point to a game on our shelves and say, this is a game about making money. Usually it's about some kind of theme, and apparently making money is not all that interesting to us as far as the theme goes. About the closest we can get to that in our collection is a game called London. We have the second edition of London, which we haven't played the first edition, but by most accounts, the second is better. If you find it in the stores, you'll find the second edition. And London is a great game. And London is an economic game where you are trying to make money. You make money and then you spend the money and you make more money. And that's the nature of an economic game. But this one, maybe more than most, is all about the economic engine. Basically, what you're doing is you're spending money that you have in hand to build, for instance, a fire department or a shipyard or a monument of some sort or cobblers. There are all kinds of different buildings and whatnot that you can make. And you set them out in your tableau in front of you in your turn. That's what you do. And then another turn you may do it again, or you may buy some property that's available to you. And then at some point you run your engine as part of your turn. And what we mean by running your engine is basically you operate your city. All of the cities are supposed to do certain things for you, and oftentimes making money. They do that. And you make a lot of money, and then you go buy more cards or more real estate or whatever. And it goes on and on and on like that. And after several rounds or so, the game is over, and you count up your points, and whoever has the most points is the winner. Now, the interesting thing, though, about London is its nature as an engine. And it's pretty thematic as far as this goes. It is based in the Industrial Revolution. And if you have seen pictures of Oliver Twist or whatever other kind of story takes place during this period of time, you'll notice a lot of dirt. London is an extraordinarily ugly place in this area, in this period of time, because of pollution. Because the economic engine of the actual city of London 100 plus years ago involved burning a lot of coal and making a lot of smoke. And that smoke settled in forms of soot everywhere. And it was just a dirty, dirty place to live. And the more economic development that existed, the dirtier it got. Now, I'm thankful that in our era, we've moved past this. I hate pollution. I just abhor it. Ask my family. If we go to Walmart and there's a stray piece of paper laying on the ground, I'm likely to pick it up. It's just, I really, really dislike that aspect of our culture. And I'm thankful that in the modern day, we have advanced past the Industrial Revolution to the point where we can generate most of the same kind of results that we got back 150 years ago in a much cleaner and more efficient fashion. We still have a ways to go, of course, and we're working on that. but it's nothing to be compared with Industrial Revolution era London. So there's an interesting little balance here. How profitable do you want to be? Because all things being equal, the more profitable you are, the more pollution you're going to create. And there's probably a winning strategy where you just go ahead and ignore the pollution, just make as much money as you possibly can and win that way. That might work. I don't play that way, mostly because it just doesn't seem to make any sense, and partly because it's just not in my nature to promote pollution. I just don't like that. But it is an interesting philosophical exercise for us as we gather money, and we do. We're blessed by the Lord in financial ways, especially in America. We're blessed this way. It's a tremendous opportunity for us to go out and earn a living. But we need to appreciate that while we prosper in this life, there is going to be pollution. We're going to make a mess of things. And to an extent, at least, you could argue the more successful we are in the things of this life, the more pollution we're going to generate. And so it's important for us to look at passages like Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, where we're told the one who's stealing, let him steal no more, but rather let him labor with his hands, providing something so that he can be able to provide for somebody else who has need. Or 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse number 8, where the one who does not provide for his own is worse than an infidel. It says he's denied the faith. When we are going out finding our success in this life, we need to see it not just in terms of what we are doing for ourselves, but also, and more importantly, what this empowers us to do for other people. How can we use our physical blessings, our financial blessings, in a spiritual way? Now, there are ways, of course, that we can promote the preaching of the gospel and the spread of the gospel. That's a great thing, but also just generosity of heart, generosity of wallet. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 18 and 19, instruct them that is these rich ones to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is treasure indeed. That's the goal. That's always the goal for us in financial areas, not just to have money. If you have money, great. Nothing wrong with having money. It's the love of money that's the root of all kinds of evil. What we need to do is make sure that whatever we do have, however much or however little, we use it to plant seeds in the Spirit, to sow to the Spirit, and not just to accumulate things for ourselves. Everything in this life that's given to us, everything is an opportunity for us to either draw closer to God or pull further away from God. Let's make sure that our physical blessings are used to draw us closer to God, help us to be stronger Christians, and not the other way around. Anyway, that's what I've been playing. Thank you for listening to the Citizen of Heaven podcast. If you profited from your time here, I have a few requests of you. Please pray for me and for this work. We need more citizens of heaven, and our prayer is that we be part of achieving this objective. Please subscribe to this podcast and give a good rating on iTunes and other sites that allow you to do such things, and spread the word to your friends. Please follow my work through my website, www.halhammons.com. There you'll find links to articles, videos, and books of mine. Seek me out on social media. You can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and especially Facebook. Look for me and for my pages, The Final Word, The Preacher, 20 Pages a Week, and Citizen of Heaven. Until next time, be strong and courageous, fight the good fight of faith, and do all things in the name of the Lord Jesus. This is Hal Hammons, the Citizen of Heaven, signing off.